Greetings, class. It's Sunday afternoon, September 13th, and I wanted to share some additional thoughts with you. I'll try to be brief, but please pay very close attention to what I have to say. When it comes to your RTOs, you're responding to others. Some of you have started to show signs of falling into kind of a pattern that I've seen in years past, and I'm mentioning it now in order to help you avoid it in the future. I want to remind everyone that your RTOs are supposed to be an interaction between you and your, classmate. And so if you read the syllabus again, you'll see that for a successful RTO, you're supposed to read what your classmate wrote, and you're supposed to respond to that, in essence, acknowledging that you read and understood what they were trying to share, and then adding your perspective, and hopefully advancing the discussion. That's part of the objective of the RTO. Not everyone's doing this, but some of you appear to be sort of identifying an issue that may be unique to the discussion, and you're kind of just carrying that from one classmate to another, saying essentially the same thing to two different classmates, and what you're saying may or may not have anything to do with what your classmate originally said. So please review the guidelines for the RTOs and abide by them for full credit. In addition, regarding this week, I realize some of you have submitted your IOWs, not everyone though. I want to point out that many of you have defined rehabilitation and trying to define what rehabilitation is to you, and you're giving some examples and things like that. That's not really what the question is asking for. I want to remind you again what the question is asking for. The question states, from a community correctional perspective, what does rehabilitation look like as a philosophy, and then likewise as a correctional policy? And if you recall, if you watched the video that I posted yesterday, and only a few of you have, I'm not being vain when I keep track of these views. I just want to know to what extent those videos are being accessed. Not very many people have watched the video, and frankly it shows. So please review video number 3 and video number 2 for that matter. This is the 4th video this semester so far. And think about those two things that I mentioned yesterday. The guiding philosophy would be to answer the question, what should the correctional system value if rehabilitation is at the core? What should correctional intervention look like if rehabilitation were the primary policy, if rehabilitation was the priority over all other objectives? So many of you have been straying in your responses from the purpose of that question. For this week, there are 2 articles that are assigned, and you need to read both articles thoroughly and in great detail. One article, the first article that you'll see listed in this week's, or in week 4 folder, an article by Banta, Rug, Scott, Bergeon, and Yassine, looking into the black box of community supervision. The article will begin by discussing a little bit about what community supervision has looked like. For starters, I would encourage you to think about when you were a lot younger perhaps, and you weren't able to do something unless you had adult supervision. All right, it may seem like kind of a silly example, but think about that. What does that mean? What does that mean to be supervised? What does that mean to, as a kid, for example, to have adult supervision? Well, presumably that means that there is a responsible adult looking out for the person, correcting them where needed, and making sure that nothing bad happens, right? I mean, that's essentially what supervision in the most general sense means. Supervision, when it comes to community corrections, when it comes to community supervision, and we're primarily talking about probation and parole supervision, when we look at community supervision over the last 100 years, it's pretty much looked kind of the same across the decades. You have a probation officer or a parole officer who has a caseload of individuals in the community that they need to keep track of. And however, what that specifically means, keeping track of somebody, may vary from one person to the next. It may vary from one era, one decade to the next. Well, that article, looking into the black box of community supervision, think about what that means, looking into the black box or Pandora's box. We know generally, most of us might have some idea of what we think we mean when we say supervision, but specifically what goes on when during the interaction, for example. Think about the interaction between an officer and a client. What does that consist of? Is it useful? Is it effective? What do we mean by effectiveness? What does successful supervision look like? What does a successful probationer or parolee look like? So think about that when you get into that article. In addition, there's a second article by Trotter, equally as important, that explores different types of supervision and helps to determine empirically what their effectiveness may be. So looking at this week's questions, again, I want to focus on the questions again because I feel like this week a lot of folks really strayed from the purpose of the question and didn't really get at the meat of the matter as to what I was hoping you would focus in on. But week 4. How is the practice discussed in the 2 articles? So don't ignore one or the other. You need to read both articles and read them both thoroughly and in great detail. How is the practice discussed in the 2 articles different from the practice you saw in A Hard Straight? So again, I'm asking you to draw on the material that you observed in the documentary, but your answers should not be simply about the documentary. You need to use the material that's in the article in order to get a good amount of credit for your responses. Second question. What are your thoughts about the differences you observed? Now here, again, I am interested in what you think, hence the question. What are your thoughts about the differences that you observed? But a really good answer would be one that, again, uses the material that you read in the articles in order to respond to that question. So tie it back to the literature. Probably won't be the last time I make that recommendation. But do keep all that in mind as we go forward. I will post your week 4 questions in very short order. Good luck and enjoy the rest of the weekend.